Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session on debt swaps for climate and nature. The time is now. My name is Paul Steele, and I'm from IID, the International Institute for Environment and Development, based in the UK. We've been advocating for some time what we call a climate and nature debt relief, or CANDA, which in just the same way as HIPC was dedicated to poverty reduction, CANDA would be an international initiative for debt relief linked to climate and nature action. It would need to be upscaled to involve all creditors, and including the private sector, China and the multilaterals, and linked to key performance indicators, or KPIs, and channeled through the budget so that countries have national ownership and it's accountable as much as possible based on fiduciary standards to the country's population. So we're very pleased today to have an absolutely stellar panel. You can see them all sitting here. So just to kick off, I'm going to invite from the International Monetary Fund, Cristina Costial, to give some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. It's great to be here. For me, this is the opening event, so I'm really pleased to be here, and thanks for inviting the IMF. I think all of us would agree with the statement that our world is facing multiple challenges. Some of these challenges are fast-moving and hard to predict, and just think about the spikes in food and energy prices from Russia's invasion to Ukraine. But others move more slowly, and they are visible long before their worst impacts arrive. And the crisis of climate and debt are in this category. The question we want to talk today about is, can debt swaps solve both of these crises? And before answering this question, I want to talk a little bit about how debt and climate are linked. So on the one hand, you have countries that are vulnerable to climate change, and they face additional expenditures. And it's really a triple whammy. They must spend to improve resilience, they must spend to cover reconstruction costs, and then borrowing is more expensive for them because climate risks are priced into their risk profile. And just think, across the Caribbean region, the average cost of storms has been close to 3% of GDP annually since the 1990s, or nearly 140% of output on a compounded basis. Major weather events, and think about here Hurricane Ivan, think about Hurricane Maria, they've wiped out multiples of GDP in countries like Grenada and Dominica. And then on the other hand, what you have is a large debt burden that comes with a large debt service. And that shrinks a country's fiscal space. And it makes it harder for the country to invest in resilience or into disaster preparedness. So it is a vicious circle for those countries where climate vulnerabilities exacerbate debt vulnerabilities and vice versa. So the consensus to date has been to treat these two issues, climate debt, separately. So to address and help countries in their climate vulnerabilities, the most effective tools are typically climate conditional grants and concessional loans. With grants, the better option in today's environment of elevated debt vulnerabilities. But as we know, grant resources regularly fall short of what is needed. On the other hand, to bring debt issues under control, that would usually require a fiscal adjustment and reforms to enhance growth. And when problems are so deep that there is no feasible adjustment that can achieve debt sustainability, countries need to restructure their debt using mechanisms such as the Common Framework. But such restructuring can be complex and it can take a long time. And that requires, of course, negotiation among creditors, and whether that is Paris Club, non-Paris Club, private creditors, public creditors. So it's a really complex process. So in general, it is more straightforward to treat the two crises, climate and debt, as separate. There are, and now we're getting to the point, there are circumstances, however, where it can make sense to bundle the debt and climate issues together. And that is when neither a debt restructuring nor adequate climate grants are on the table. And we've outlined these in a recent IMF working paper. And here in the audience, we have Kemal, who is one of the authors of the paper. So debt for climate swaps can be such an instrument. And why? Because the swaps would offer developing countries with little fiscal space the opportunity to undertake urgently needed climate investments. And we've seen that. There have been recent debt for nature operations in the Seychelles, in Belize and Barbados, and they show that such transactions are feasible. The big challenge now is how to increase not only the number of these transactions, but also the size of these debt swaps. And we see here three opportunities. The first opportunity is to strengthen the market infrastructure, and this by simplifying how creditors can monitor progress on the climate side. Moving to broad metrics, such as carbon emissions or deforestation, that would allow more projects to be considered, and it would also reduce the need for expensive evaluations on a project-by-project basis. So these are the KPIs Paul was just talking about. Similarly, carbon credits could facilitate mitigation measures as part of a swap. Now, such credits would need to be well designed to avoid greenwashing and to align climate actions underpinning debt swaps with global mitigation efforts. Then the second opportunity is to step up the number of transactions by moving from one-off projects to multiple projects and bundling them together. And here creditors could support a range of activities grouped together by type of activity. So for example, investments in resilience or investments to decommission coal plants. And where countries have a strong public financial management, a programmatic approach could have a big impact because resources for climate spending could be channeled directly through national budgets. The third opportunity I want to talk about is to structure the swaps to maximize fiscal space that is available for climate by bringing the biggest amount of debt to the table. And how? By buying up debt from other creditors on the secondary market, and ideally that on a discount. And what's more, the cost of the new debt instrument incurred for the buyback can be further reduced by leveraging green investments or reducing the risks by seeking guarantees from donors. And all of these design considerations are important for how much fiscal space can be provided and how much then investment spending can be supported. So let me conclude. Given the urgency we face to deal with both of the debt and climate crisis, we need to move fast. I think that is very clear to us. We at the IMF, we do what we can do. And that, for instance, is by helping countries improve their public management systems and making the public management systems green. We can help them by incorporating climate risks into our debt sustainability analysis to better understand the link between debt and climate. And if a member wants to finance debt and debt service reduction operations that meaningfully reduce their debt burden and vulnerability in the context of a fund-supported program, that can be done by using our general balance of payment support. And this could be also done in the context of our Resilience and Sustainability Trust. But that said, the IMF can't do this alone. I mean, others really need to come in strongly to scale up the debt and climate swaps. And there are NGOs, there are MDBs that have the necessary expertise to push the broader agenda forward. And while we should be clear-eyed that debt swaps are not a silver bullet that will resolve both crises, I think we can be pragmatic. And that means using those swaps to expand our toolkit for helping vulnerable countries so that they do more spending toward climate action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. So now we are very pleased to have in the room Dr. Mahmoud, but he said he'd like to listen before he gives his comments. So we'll now invite some of our colleagues on the panel to give their reflections. So we're very honored to have with us from Gabon, the Minister of Budget. So Minister, please. And she's very kindly agreed to speak in English, although she's much more comfortable in French. So please, thank you, Minister.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'm Ekiri Edith, Minister of Budget of Public Account of Gabon. Thank you for giving me the floor and for this opportunity to able to make a short remark. I am the Minister of Budget and Public Account of Gabonese Republic. African countries such as Gabon are the guardians of some of the most unique biodiversity on the planet. Our region is one of the most important carbon sinks in the world. We have invested to protect this resource for our own benefits, but also as our contribute to world heritage. At the same time, our economies have been battered by the COVID-19 pandemic and by the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. To be able to effectively transform our economy to a more sustainable value chain, we need to fiscal space to invest in. Potential income flows have become harder and harder to mobilize. Gabon has been leading effort to tap in the carbon market to raise resource, recognizing the unique role we are playing to protect the planet. Percent debt swap is a way in which we can raise additional resources to invest in our Gabon Blue Gabon strategy. A debt swap can also help us to generate predictable flows of finance specialty allocated for the climate action conversation and supporting livelihoods. We look forward to moving toward implement of such initiative alongside other innovation in carbon markets. Thank you very much for the attention. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame le Ministère. So now we're very pleased to have with us another Minister of Finance, but actually, rather ironically, he's not been able to join this COP because he's back in his own country helping to deal with a climate-related event, the hurricane in Belize. So we're very pleased to have with us the Minister of State for Finance from Belize, Minister Christopher Coy. Minister, you have the floor.
Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me to share Belize's Blue Bond Debt for Marine Conservation swap experience and its short and long-term positive impact on our economy. Based on our experience, I can confidently say that this transaction has been both good for marine conservation and for our economy. In the broader context of our climate change experience, however, I cannot help but think of the familiar phrase, one step forward, two steps back. Less than a month ago, I spoke on the benefits of mobilizing private finance at a Caribbean ministers meeting hosted by IMF's Madame Cristalina, at which I referenced the severe flooding effects on loss suffered from Hurricane Julia being experienced back home while I was giving my remarks. Not even a month later, this Wednesday past, a few days ago, we were battered by a direct hit from Hurricane Lisa. Many left homeless, cane fields flattened, with tens of millions in property and infrastructure damage and business losses. This appears, unfortunately, now par for the course. We now suffer average annual losses of no less than 4% of GDP from climate events, at least 8 times more than what developed countries experience. The impact of these losses on the public finances of vulnerable small states is no secret. Many suffer severe debt distress on top of being exposed to serious climate risk. As much as that phrase, one step forward, 2 steps back, may be apt in these circumstances, what we can at least do is to make that one step forward a giant one. Debt swaps, if favorably concluded, can constitute that giant step forward in the right direction, both for conservation and the economy. In our case, the Blue Bond transaction was an important cog in our homegrown plans to jumpstart economic recovery and transformation. Our $364 million Blue Bond, the largest of its kind to date, entirely financed by private capital, by buying out external commercial debt with a 45% discount, not only provided substantial cash flow relief, but it also provided a significant and immediate reduction of our external debt burden by 16% and our debt to GDP ratio by 25%. Our debt to GDP ratio was an unsustainable 133% in 2020. Through further fiscal consolidation, investor-friendly policies, and supernormal multi-year economic growth, the IMF estimates that we are on target to have reduced that ratio to 71% by the end of this year, roughly 8 years ahead of schedule. We are now on a path of debt sustainability, and we have now opened up much needed fiscal space for planned priority areas such as education, health, social protection, and infrastructure development. Not a moment too soon, having regard to the costs to which we are now put as a result of the unplanned loss and damage suffered from Hurricanes Julia and Lisa. This transaction also enabled the allocation of roughly $190 million towards marine conservation. The success of this transaction, and ultimately the benefits to our economy, depended on key partnerships. In particular, first, developed country participation. In our case, it was the US's Development Finance Corporation to mitigate associated perceived risks of a vulnerable small state. Without such participation, the cost of private capital would have been prohibitive. One proposed iteration of this is the involvement of multilateral development banks to reduce those perceived risks. Second, the beneficiary government maintaining a disciplined commitment to fiscal consolidation. And third, of course, private capital and technical expertise. Going forward, the Blue Bond experience has shown us a path by which, through a partnership between institutions run by developed countries, private capital, and vulnerable small states, we can not only access non-traditional sources of private finance, but we can impactfully benefit our economy in doing so. Up until now, we have been asking the developed world to lead in providing climate and development finance for climate and economic resiliency building, with limited success, straitjacketed by restrictive and exclusionary rules of an anachronistic global financial architecture. The Blue Bond transaction is a success story where the vulnerable state led, with the support of developed country institutions and private capital, to access capital at scale and on a timely basis. Perhaps a deeper, more giant lesson lies in this story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Coy. And I should say, if anyone's done the maths, it's about 1 a.m. in Belize, so we're really honored that you stayed up to show your commitment to this issue, Minister. Okay, now we turn to another part of the world, back to West Africa, And we're very pleased to have with us from the Gambia, the Minister of Environment. Please, Minister.
Thank you, esteemed panelists here present. I think having IMF in the middle of this discussion is very assuring. Now we can say we are near to having action be implemented. The discussion of this debt swap can never be much better than now, when most of our countries are facing the highest punishment from climate change. I think if we have to list any new pandemic on the list, is climate change. It's strangling most of us to death. It is sentencing us deeper into poverty. So I think we have to think and think wise. Most of the points I have today has been already addressed by the IMF speaker. Hence, I will just add few points to make it more weighted. We have to look at the model case by case. And in this case, we can look at the pre and post incidents. For example, a country like the Gambia, who has submitted a well-praised NDC2, should be given priority in implementing to swap as a post, as a preconditions. And again, as said by one of the speakers, carbon credit is driving the new market. Africa has emitted very little, almost insignificant. And the Gambia has been said to have only 0.01%. Why should we suffer this much? Why should the vulnerable countries suffer this much? I'm happy that IMF is coming up with this brilliant thinking to match the agenda of our president. He once made this pronouncement that we need debt reliefs. We need to be given space to have a breathing space to respond to the climate change, mitigation and adaptations, and build resilience. He already said this. But now, when it's come to the business environment, the first thing they think is give and take. That is what we call business. And the economics would say nothing goes for free. We agree. If you want to give us space, those that are at the receiving end would start complaining, and they could make a case that they are also struggling with financial crisis and they need their monies back. But if we say give and take, I think the topic is very fitting to purpose. The give and take is something that we have to definitely buy in. And we have to be serious when we say we're going to do it. A lot has been said since scientists came up with the agenda of climate change. We need actions. Gambia has been very ambitious on this list. We've set our target very high. As small as we are, we have been praised to top the list of those who are ready to join the climate call. Now, the debt that we are owing is strangling us to death, even worse than climate change. If we are to allow to build our infrastructure to respond to this, building resilience, it is definitely justice to give us something in return. We have something to sell. We have a case to make, just like other vulnerable countries. And now is the time that people respond to this with equality. We need to be responded to. Emitting 0.01%, and yet still you have been strangled to death, to sink deeper into poverty, is not justice. And we call in that this initiative, the agenda today, is just right to the point. I don't know who thought about it, but would be a great economist. Exchange for exchange, give me, I give you. So we really appreciate, and my country, my president, is really in support of this. But what we are asking is to implement now. Ideas have been put on the table, very brilliant one, just like this one. We need implementation. We need to implement this. We have something to sell, just like the vulnerable countries. We have the carbon credit there. We have our NDC2 that has set targets to implement. Last year's rain, or this year's rain, is because we are still in it, has just set us a very strong message. if we don't act now and smartly, we will spend more than it is realistic to fix the problem of climate change. On that note, I sincerely joined our political will to say we support this initiative, and we look forward to it being implemented now and never tomorrow. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Minister. A very impassioned plea, and hopefully that is heard in the halls down the corridor in the plenary. Now we're very pleased to turn over to the other side of Africa, to the Seychelles, and we are very pleased to have the Minister of Environment from Seychelles.
Okay, good morning. Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here amongst colleagues and people who have participated with Seychelles in the previous debt for adaptation swap deals. I will not go into the geography of Seychelles. I think you all know about Seychelles, where it is, 115 islands off the east coast of Africa. And like many island states, we are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So the debt for adaptation swap is a way for the Seychelles to extract additional funding and to get additional space to be able to implement measures to conserve biodiversity and also address climate change issues. But on the other hand, we also have to remember that Seychelles, even if we are a small island state, we are also a large oceanic state. And being a large oceanic state, helping Seychelles to conserve what it has would also bring a lot of global benefits, especially in terms of biodiversity and climate protection. So it works in two ways. Other countries with which we are indebted could help us to conserve what we have, which in turn would help us bring about global benefits. Just to go back over the history a little bit, at the time of the financial crisis in 2008, Seychelles had a debt to GDP of 175%. So it was quite difficult, and Seychelles negotiated its debt with the Paris Club, and we got a haircut, but still there was not enough space to implement all that the country wanted to do at that time. So government decided at that time, and I think Mr. Adam, who's here with us now with this year, he was one of the people in the drawing room helping to draw up the plans, to use the resources that we have, to channel that in a way to actually derive benefits for the country, to help us achieve economic goals and at the same time conservation and climate goals. Seychelles at the time had been aiming to increase its oceanic space under protection as a means of boosting resilience, and it was very good that this could come together and we could do a deal for the benefit of the country and also for the benefit of the world. So in 2015, Seychelles aimed to raise additional climate finance through a debt swap to support the creation of marine protected areas covering 30% of its EZ and also improving biodiversity. So 30% of EZ, you must realize, is a huge area. Seychelles, the marine space of Seychelles is about 1.44 million, and 30% under protection means a large part of it will be set aside with no harvesting of maritime products and also limitations on the kind of activities that can take place in that area. So in 2015, the government of Seychelles, in partnership with the Nature Conservancy and the Seychelles Climate Adaptation Trust, which was set up at that time, concluded a $21.6 million swap that started generating from that point onwards significant benefits for the country. I think you've all heard of SECAT, which is the Seychelles Climate Adaptation Trust, Climate Change Adaptation Trust. This is a standalone entity that was set up to handle the deal, and it is the entity that is actually holding all that finance and is dealing on one side with the government of Seychelles and on the other side with creditors, and it is 50% ownership between Seychelles and the other partner, which is the Nature Conservancy. So the SECAT is an independent, not-for-profit, non-governmental organization with a vision of supporting Seychelles' investment in blue future and also by mobilizing and investing resources in the Seychelles blue economy. So As part of the debt swap, SECAT starts with ensuring impact investors are repaid and managing a Blue Grants Fund and also a Blue Endowment Fund. So what does the deal that was concluded in 2015 do? The swap converts a portion of the Seychelles debt to other countries into more manageable debt held by the local entity. To accomplish this refinancing, the Nature Conservancy has provided 21.6 million in an impact capital loan and 5 million in grants to buy back 29.6 million of Seychelles debt at a discount of 5.4%. So under the deal, government now owes SECAT money, and money is actually paid back in local currency. So what would the debt service repayment do? The debt service repayments will fund 3 streams. One is to repay impact investors, the ones who help us buy back the loan. The other one is to capitalize SECAT's endowment, and also to fund work on the ground that advances marine and coastal conservation, including strategies for ecosystem-based climate adaptation and also disaster risk reduction. So the estimated amount to be invested in the conservation activities and the endowment through the debt swap would be $13 million. I know, like Belize mentioned earlier on, they are pushing for a bigger one, a bigger debt swap, and it's at a higher amount. But for us, it was a good start, and it helps kickstart a long process where we now have a system where money is being generated on an annual basis that is actually going into conservation measures, and that is making things possible on the ground. So the actual declaration of the 30% protection was done in 2020, and that was one of the milestones under the deal that the Seychelles government had to do. And that's equal to 410,000 square kilometers of sea. So what are the main benefits achieved through the debt swap? The Seychelles government benefited from a lower average interest rate as the maturity of the debt was extended from 8 to 13 years. The balance of payment was improved as payments was made in local currency. 5.7 million USD of additional finance was channeled towards ocean conservation. And also we had redirection of 11 million US dollars previously channeled to external debt service, which was channeled towards in-country investment. And also we have the capital endowment of $6.6 million for SECAT to allow long-term opportunity for further mobilization of capital through the trust fund. And also, as part of the deal, we had to do a marine special plan and protect 400,000 square kilometers of new marine protected areas. So what are the benefits of a debt swap? And I think that's one of the things that countries are interested in. What are the actual benefits of doing a debt swap? One is that it provides the increased fiscal space. Some of the participants on this panel have already talked about this. It does provide an increased fiscal space for the country. It links debt instruments with the country climate and nature priorities, and it helps relieve pressure on the fiscal space by reducing the need for sovereign borrowing and allowing expenditure in priority areas. So economically, it does help a lot, and especially for a small country like us, $21 million is a huge amount. It also improves inclusive economic growth and climate and nature outcomes. Climate and nature crisis can destabilize economic activities, so there is an urgent need to increase climate resilience and environmental sustainability across all sectors and parts of the economy. So this debt swap, it actually helps in making the economy function as a whole, and it does help to integrate climate and nature outcomes into the economic direction and the economic objectives of the country. It also, and on the Seychelles side, we have noted that it helps in leveraging existing credit, and also it creates investor interest. This is one of the big things. Seychelles is using this, and other countries can use this as a leverage in negotiations with their creditors. Debt forgiveness is politically challenging and can harm investor confidence for future investment. So climate and nature-linked instruments like swaps or new issuance of loans or performance bond can be a way to increase investor interest, because they signal proactive management of the economy. And I think that is one point that was made earlier on about the fact that we have to have discipline and we have to show discipline. So it is a way of showing proactive management in the economy, and that actually creates that confidence and helps you move other things that could not have been moved before. So for Seychelles, it has also helped, and it has also helped attract a lot of attention from other partners who otherwise would not have been that much interested in doing deals with Seychelles. So it is a catalytic thing that can actually kickstart a lot of positive processes within the economy of the country. And also it helps in accessing of new sustainable finance markets. So it builds the data government's experience and capacity in working with innovative financing instruments. And we see that in Seychelles. Through the Seychelles Climate Adaptation Trust and the partners that we are working with, we are gradually building up capacity within our ministry, within the Ministry of Finance, and within other parts of the economy, where we are having better informed, better educated, better skilled people who can actually go out and do other deals and work out other solutions for the country in terms of innovative finance mechanisms. I would end by talking a little bit about why debt swaps are good for people, because we have to remember this is all about people, and this is all about the global benefits that we can bring. It allows the government to create additional space, of course, for investment in priority areas, and this will benefit things like education, health, and we're talking about the post-COVID experience, we talk about disasters. It enables you to actually deal with those issues because you have the space. It creates the balance of payment benefits, and this is a way for the country to actually reduce the load on the economy and reduce the foreign exchange impact, and that helps when you have financial crisis or economic crisis. The climate and nature crisis would actually destabilize the economic activity. So in the case of Seychelles, erosion, inundation, and climate risk are some of the risks that we face.
Sorry, Minister, if I can ask you to...
I'm trying to wrap up.
Sorry, thanks.
I'll end. I have so much, so much to tell. And okay, I'll just end with this. So one of the things that the debt swap has done for Seychelles and with the creation of SECAT is that it has helped through the rolling out of regular financing for the sector. It has helped us to invest in job-creating, inclusive, and climate biodiversity activities. So we have a lot more partners, a lot more persons, a lot more entities actually engaging and building up their own capacity. So it provides that mechanism to actually support them to grow in the sector and to come up with solutions for the country. So thank you. And I would end by acknowledging the presence of my colleague from also the TNC on my right, who has been a key partner working with us, and it raises the importance of having a partner that you can work with closely and in the long term, and that can have the confidence to work with you throughout the whole process. So it's important that you have a partner to dance with when you do this. So please go out and find a good partner. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Minister. We're honored to have you here, and it sounds from your speech that if you had to get up in the morning to join a webinar like this, you would also do
I will.
it.
I will.
Okay. Well, now we're very honored to have with us Dr. Mahmoud, who needs no introduction, but he's the climate champion and has been instrumental in the ongoing negotiations in this COP. So we're hoping that the recommendations and discussions from this session will feed directly into the Finance Day plenary. Dr. Mahmoud, do you want to come up and please...
Right. Thank you so much. Good morning. Thank you so much, Paul, for your kind introduction. And very pleased that I had the opportunity to listen to the very important and constructive interventions. And before I say anything further, I'd like to welcome you in Egypt, welcome you in Sharm el-Sheikh. And if there is anything that I can do to help and support your work or facilitate your engagements, please don't hesitate to contact me and my team. And of course, the presidency of the COP is able to help in any possible way. But we're honored really to have you all here in Egypt in such difficult times facing the world in not just in climate, but as mentioned in debt and other aspects, especially after two major global crises, COVID and then Ukraine war, or the war in the Ukraine, with serious implications on the rest of the world. I praise the great work of ministers and governments from Belize, Seychelles, and Barbados And I appreciate as well the good words coming from the minister from Gabon, and of course the very passionate speech by the minister from the Gambia. When we consider the possibilities under the debt swaps, we need to consider them as a kind of a second best solution, given that we cannot really go into that first best solution, that countries shouldn't be in debt for climate and shouldn't be in such a state that either a country is in debt difficulty or in a debt crisis or in a debt catastrophe. These are basically the categories that you can classify many of the developing economies today. With what Ms. Kostiel led us to understand about issues of debt, and based on the updates coming from the IMF and the World Bank, when we check countries facing risks or already in distress, they have been growing and growing fast. And any kind of solution for climate would require finance. Now we are facing a kind of a finance architecture that could be simply described as insufficient, inefficient, and unfair. It's insufficient because, if I can just, from a very interesting piece by Montek Ahluwalia and his co-author, Mr. Patel, in a piece that is going to be published in a book by Brookings, cite these figures coming from IMF, UN IPCC, IEA, McKinsey, and the Climate Policy Initiative, CPI. Figures are ranging between 2.8 trillion, you have 3.3 trillion, 3.7 trillion, 3.5 trillion, 4.5 trillion. These are figures that are required per year to deal only with one aspect related to climate, which is about energy transition. So any kind of consideration for the importance of finance coming, say, from the old promise of Copenhagen, the 100 billion, at best, this is like 2 to 3% of the gaps. If you exclude OECD countries' requirements and China, assuming that they can take care of themselves, will be left with around $1.2 to $1.3 trillion of gap a year. And assuming that countries can do a better job in listening to the IMF and the World Bank and the UN system to do a better job in domestic resource mobilization and allocate better funding for climate, this will leave us with at least $600 billion a year. So again, the 100 billion that has never come in full will really leave us with a gap. Now, that, as mentioned by my good colleague from the fund, Christian, that has been really growing fast, and I think I don't need to go by the numbers, and we didn't listen carefully to the advice after the global financial crisis. And now the countries from the developing world are much more indebted, and many of them, as I said, are in distress. The figure is growing by 8%. To external debt accumulation to around $11.1 trillion in 2021. So this is at least 3 times the level that we had back in 2009. So any kind of work that can really help us to deal with this insufficiency of funds could really help. And I think the good examples that came from Seychelles, Belize, and Barbados, each one of them has its own characteristic, and we have many lessons to learn from them in the developing world. Linking the finance to climate, linking finance to nature, and then to have the more general approach with a KPI-based approach, and you link the KPI to the NDCs, so we can perhaps have more flexibility and can have some policy-measured approach rather than just the project one, which is very much appreciated. Like speakers, including the minister from Seychelles, the work by TNC is very much appreciated, and more of this work would be definitely required. So I said why, I explained why I said that the financial architecture is leaving a lot to be desired when it comes to the sufficiency of funds. because of the huge gaps. Why it is inefficient? Unfortunately, because some of the financiers, it takes them 2 to 3 years from the day you shake hands with them until you get the funds to the projects or the country in questions. And this is a typical issue of concern, if you listen carefully, especially to small islands and many of the developing countries. This is too long for any kind of consideration related to the urgency of the funding and the kind of cost that is basically with serious implication on that. So anything that we can do to expedite the process, that would be very much appreciated. And then this gets me into the last point, why we're considering, or I am considering, that the funds are coming with high cost, which is unfair. The minister from Gambia asked why we suffer, because unfortunately this is an unfair world, and the poor stand to suffer the most. This is what we have been seeing, from debt to crisis to other shocks that they are exposed to. But the issue of cost here is basically about the unfairness, because you cannot really go and borrow double digit for problems that were not caused by you. We are borrowing heavily because countries, since the first industrial revolutions, have been accumulating their emissions, and we need now to pay jointly for such big mistake that happened. When they discovered, those advanced economies, that they have to fix matter, that was too late. And the first line of defense, which is basically reducing emissions, we are not really achieving it based on the all of the reports that we are getting, that we are drifting from targets. When it comes to adaptation, again, the funds available are not sufficient to cover the 5% of GDP in average that a typical developing economy needs to spend on that. Then, of course, loss and damage is another argument that will take many sessions during this summit here. So as far as we can reduce the cost of borrowing, as far as we can really do something useful, including debt reduction mechanisms, and debt swaps is very much welcome in this context. But I have to say 2 more things on that. Again, the partnership with TNC, and we hope to have more TNCs in operation, and we need to extend their work more to middle-income countries. And there are many candidates, including some countries in this room, so you have lots of business coming to your side soon. But at the same time, I'd like just to share something that came out during discussion that we had with colleagues who established the sustainability-linked sovereign debt hub. And it's offering lots of good work. And you can talk to Simon Zadek if he's around, and talk to Justin Mundy who's here, and the other colleagues who are working hard in this hub. They provide technical assistance, support, and knowledge sharing, and they can really provide more than that, and you can check them in their work that is becoming available now. And the final practical solution, when it comes to speed, when it comes to efficiency and cost, there are 2 examples in existence that we need to build on. One is related to IDA, the International Development Association. It has been in existence for many years. It's one of the most efficient vehicles for, not just for dissemination of funds, but basically for communication and prioritization of the kind of spending that you'd require in partnership between the beneficiaries and the donor countries or the contributors. And it is efficient because it knows how to get business. In terms of governance and accountability, it has a good record. And equally important, when it comes to terms of funding, it's 10 years, grace, 40 years maturity, and as low as 1.2% when it comes to the cost of borrowing. I'm very happy and proud that the IMF, when it established the Resilience and Sustainability Trust Fund, it had these kind of experience and benchmarks. The RST is with grace of 10 years, and it has up to 20 years of maturity. The cost is of the, over the rate of the SDR by a small margin. So these are examples in existence that you need really to take as the first entry point when you are getting into debt. But when we get out from debt, there are many solutions, including, of course, the swaps. I like what the Minister of Gabon said as well about the potential from the carbon market. We are working closely with your honorable colleague, the Minister of Environment and Climate, Mr. Lee White, and we see how can we establish a carbon credit market for Africa that has integrity, good regulations, and linking it to debt reduction mechanisms. Having said that, while I appreciate very much the way that you presented the problems, I appreciate more because this is a summit and a conference about solutions and implementation, what we are putting forward in order to deal with these big challenges facing us. Thank you so much and welcome to Egypt.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Mahmoud. As we said, it's great to have your support from the presidency side, and we look forward to seeing some of these views reflected in the plenary discussions. So now we turn to some of the many other stakeholders who need to be involved in this kind of transaction. So first of all, we'd like to hear from the communities. It's all very well to say that national governments should be involved, but what about the local communities at the front line? So we're going to hear from Pauline Nantonga from EcoTrust.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be speaking with you this morning. And my levels of understanding have already significantly increased by listening to people from Seychelles, Belize, Gabon, Gambia, IMF. Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity. So for me, I would like to speak from the perspective of the effectiveness of such a system or such an innovation. Financing comes, financing mechanisms and so on, they are always developed and they come. Many times, the taste of the pudding is in the eating. Until when we get to that level where all the stakeholders are involved meaningfully in these innovations, we will not be able to really address the issue. I liked the examples that, for example, came from Seychelles. I mean, he had a long list of stakeholder this, stakeholder that, stakeholder this. So most of the time, and even when the minister from Gabon was talking, even at least from Africa, you can see that there is a very active relationship between the people, the land, and the biodiversity. Most of the times when we are in these rooms, we have this satellite imagery, we see where there is a forest, we see where there is a river, and you want to link this forest to this river. We don't understand that there are real people that are having real interactions with these landscapes. And it's very important to be looking at these things from the socio-ecological characteristics. Most of the times we have this overview that is looking at, for example, the biophysical characteristics, but it's very important to understand that the socioeconomics and the biophysical characteristics are equally important. So it's very useful when we are coming up with, for example, the key performance indicators to ensure that these reflect the needs and aspirations of the people in these landscapes or on the ground. And it shouldn't just stop at the planning, but also even when it comes to the implementation. It is important for these groups, the indigenous people, the local communities, plus the other local stakeholders, to be involved in the monitoring of the KPIs. They need to give feedback that indeed what the countries committed themselves in the swaps, in the agreements, is indeed what is happening. But also, these people are at the front line when it comes to vulnerability, but also they hold the key. When my house is on fire, the neighbor cannot be more concerned about putting the fire out of my house than I am. So it is not required that you displace people out of these landscapes, for example, in order to restore them. So it is important that even when it comes to implementing the innovations that we are coming up with, we work with the people so that they build the resilience of the landscapes on which they depend. anyway. And in a manner that is equitable and is representative of the needs and the aspirations. So the key, the vulnerability, the people that are at the front line, they need urgent attention, but also we need to work with them as opposed to throwing them into further despair in order to save the planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pauline. And so now we're going to turn to a couple more stakeholders. We've heard from the IMF, a crucial creditor. We're going to hear in a moment from the TNC about their role. But what about the private sector? They're a key creditor. So we're very pleased to have with us on the panel Deutsche Bank, who's one of the more progressive banks and are interested in getting involved in these kind of transactions. So Claire, over to you for your comments.
Perfect. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Thank you very much for having me here. So as a banker, I think I'm okay. As a banker, I always need to start with numbers, and I think the numbers that I'm going to go through will put into perspective how important this discussion is on debt for nature swap and really mobilizing capital to this effort, especially in the economic environment that we're in today. So a quarter of EM issuers right now are trading at spreads of over 1,000 basis points. So that's over 10% without the base rate, which is obviously increasing as US interest rates and global interest rates increase. So you can get a perspective on how and what that means for debt sustainabilities in emerging market countries. And although this, even though it's a quarter of issuers that are at these spreads, it actually affects the smallest issuers, the most frontier nations in terms of the impact of this rising interest rates. And then the other fundamentals we see in the market now is with quantitative easing, or the reversal of quantitative easing, that risk is coming off. And whereas we used to have a lot of crossover investors going from high-grade credits, developed market credits into emerging markets, we're actually seeing a reversal of that now because spreads are more interesting in less risky market. So this has a snowball effect in terms of what the liquidity implications are for emerging markets as a whole, which is obviously not a positive story, but I think it's important to put it in the context of nature and what these debt for nature swaps means when we look at the investor interest. So definitely what we're hearing from our client base, from our institutional investors, and even ourselves institutionally, how we deploy our own balance sheet, combining nature positive outcomes in fixed income instruments is something that our investors want to see. We have heard this repeatedly. We are starting, especially in places like Europe, in France, for example, we're seeing the legislation move in the direction that investors are being forced to disclose how they are investing in a nature positive way for their investments. And it's actually very, very difficult as an investor to find nature positive investments. And what these instruments do is actually afford investors a way to achieve that. So take their investment cash flows in a way that can demonstrably be nature positive. Can do it at scale, because that's another thing of the capital markets. They like big liquid instruments. And lastly, it enables them to invest in an instrument which is investment grade, which I think we haven't really spoken about this on this panel, but the real key element to these instruments is that there is a credit enhancement provided by a DFI to get the instrument from, in the case of Believe, they were in selective distress, but if we look at Barbados sub-investment grade to the investment grade. And this is where the bulk of capital flows are in the fixed income market. They're not in the sub-investment grade. Over 90% is in the high grade space. And the high rated the instrument, AA, AAA, the more you're going to see liquidity flowing in that direction. So I think, from a Deutsche Bank perspective, we are hugely excited about these instruments, and we do see the benefit all around, the benefit from the emerging market stakeholders in terms of not having them be forced to think about nature as a as an alternative to the needs that they need to address in their countries anyway, because they have so many competing needs on the developmental side, education, healthcare, basic infrastructure, that nature has really been at the very bottom of the priority list. What this does is actually say, well, you can have your cake and eat it too. You can do good on nature, you can reduce your debt service, and you can actually address what is fundamental, especially today, which is an asset liability management, terming out your debt at a better interest rate. So what we'd like to see as a bank is, and I commend everyone here, TNC and the DFIs and then the emerging markets, for really being ambitious in thinking about how to scale up this market. What I would like to see is actually more DFIs join this. This should not just be a DFC, an IEDB. This should be every global DFI thinking about how they can support this initiative. Global DFIs, I would call on also the regional insurance companies like ATI, ISIC, to think about how they can support this effort. With that, the more capital we can deploy, the more formats we can apply it to, whether it's a bond format, whether it's a loan format, we can really catalyze this market and bring liquidity to the areas that need it most. We heard about carbon credit, and I think debt for nature swap is certainly one solution. I definitely would like to see more in the area of carbon credit. We have seen countries in Africa, Gabon being one of them, who have really led the way in terms of over many, many, many years, doing the right thing in terms of reducing deforestation, conserving their forest, afforestation, and creating a verified path of carbon credits, which should now get the benefit of nature-based payments from sovereigns, from multinationals, from corporates. And what we'd love to see is these institutions stepping up in the form of offtake contracts, in the form of carbon convertible debt. We have lots of different structural ideas which we can talk to you about. But I think this needs to happen because this is a way to channel funding to emerging market, which is not incrementally a debt burden for them. So we'd love to see more of that. And I think those are my key points. So thank you very much for having me here. Super excited to be part of this panel.
Great, thanks. So thank you, Claire. We're moving towards the end. We've only got a few minutes left, and I'm keen to leave some time for questions and answers. So I'd encourage people to keep their responses brief. But Jennifer Morris, who's the Chief Executive Officer at the Nature Conservancy, has been waiting patiently, been praised by the panel, and now it's your turn to speak.
Thanks so much, Paul. It's great to be here. I'm really happy that I'm following Claire, because this is a moment. If you just think about who's up here, we've all been talking about private-public partnerships and getting more private capital into nature, into climate for decades. Now you're seeing it. It's happening. And TNC is so proud to be here, standing hand in hand with several governments that have raised their hand and said, we want to invest in the climate solution, in our coastal resiliency, and protecting our people for the freight train that is climate change that's happening now. But we can't do it with these levels of debt. And there's not enough philanthropy in the world to actually solve this problem. So this here, I hope, is really the start of a huge wave of successful solutions that we can take to scale. But as Claire said, we need the DFIs. We were able to, through these 3 transactions, starting with the pioneering work in the Seychelles and then Belize and Barbados, to refinance, to convert over $500 million of debt of nations that desperately needed that money to be converted, and turned it into $230 million of money for conservation. That's great. We see $10 billion easily right now of opportunity that can turn $2 billion into conservation, again, with not one penny of new philanthropy coming from the private sector. This is amazing. That the opportunity for conservation here is huge. If you think about what we're trying to do in just the ocean space alone, with this portfolio we're looking at, we could save oceans the size of the entire United States. And that's just on the ocean side. We're looking at lots of terrestrial deals as well. But to scale, we need the DFIs. We need the DFIs to help us to get to investment grade. Through the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the DFC facilities, we're able to do a lot, but we need more. So Claire's plea is exactly right. All of you in this room that have connections to development finance institutions, please tell them we need the DFC to have more capacity. We need IDB, ADB, every B out there to really be on board with helping us do more of these transactions, because it's a lifeboat for countries. And we can help build coastal resiliency and protect nature at the same time. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And thank you also, for your crucial role in this set of transactions. And also, we've got maybe 5 minutes for questions. So I'd invite if anyone has questions. Yeah, we've got one, maybe we've got time for 3. So do you want to kick off? Please, and introduce yourself if you don't mind.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jeff Hall. I'm with Open Society Foundations, and thank you. It's been a great panel. Maybe to be a little bit provocative here, I know we're talking about the race to resilience, and we heard a little bit from Mahmoud about the numbers that we need. And I mean, I guess it just strikes me that so far we're talking about pretty low numbers, even on the outside case, maybe 10 billion. There was a former head of state at the end of the World Bank annual meetings who had another suggestion that was that would get us to scale very, very quickly, which is for countries just to stop paying their debt and to use it for adaptation and loss and damage. And I say that to be provocative, but also what else will get us to the kind of scale that we need in the time frame that we have?
Right, that's provocative with the IMF on the panel. So over to you for the next comment.
Thank you. Simon Jessup, Reuters. You've spoken about the DFIs. What are they saying to you? What is the current temperature check from them? How optimistic are you that we'll get a breakthrough at this COP? And second question, just about China. They seem to be, on the list of pretty much every country. As a creditor, what have they said? Where are they on this? And can we expect movement there? Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else? And maybe a lady wants a question after this gentleman.
Thank you very much. Mustafa Bayoumi from the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy. I was wondering, I'm looking into how we can use that for climate swaps for the Middle East and the Arab region. So I actually asked if you have any recommendations for the new regions that are exploring this option, what would you recommend and what kind of pitfalls or they shouldn't fall into?
Any more questions? Okay, well, on the Middle East question, we've got a closing remarks from Esqua, so that'll be answered. But does anyone want to answer the rather provocative question? Well, we'll start with the DFI question. Does anyone want to respond with that?
So I can try. I gotta get the mic this way. So the DFIs are interested. They have some constraints, as you can imagine. So we're working very hard on the U.S. side, working with Secretary Kerry in particular to see what we can do with the DFC to help increase the level of guarantees, loan guarantees. They do great work on the insurance side, the credit risk insurance, but we really need some guarantee increases to help us, again, bring in more private capital. There are a lot of others that are interested. They're sort of watching this space and seeing what they can do. But again, I think taking that risk, we've seen the transactions can work. Now it's time to scale.
Can I comment on that? But what are you doing to push for the World Bank to take it seriously? The World Bank is opposed to debt swap, as you know, senior management, where the IMF has done a bold move, and I don't see about the annual meeting of the World Bank. So the effort that you're doing is great, but if the elephant in the room is not moving, we have a problem.
I might ask my colleague from the IMF to answer that one. I'm going to plead the fifth.
Okay, we won't get into IMF World Bank politics right here, but it is a challenge. We do know, frankly, that management in the World Bank is not sympathetic to debt swaps, and that's a challenge for all of us. So maybe collectively we can work on that. But
I think also, I mean, I would just say in general, I think not to identify any specific DFI, I mean, the concept of providing a credit enhancement, whether it's insurance, a guarantee for an asset liability management transaction is fundamentally very different than what their mandates are. I mean, their mandates typically are to provide support for specific projects. when you talk about debt repayment, a lot of them just don't have that in their mandate. So it does require holistically a mandate shift at a very senior level.
Okay, thanks. Do you want to give one last comment?
Of course, to the provocative question. You know, what I've sensed here in the room, and Jennifer put this so nicely together, there is excitement of working together. And we are all living on the same planet. And if we don't do this working together, and we need a lot of partnerships from everybody, this is not going to work. Not paying debt is very provocative, but it's not this kind of partnership that we need. And it might help in the very short term, but it's not going to help in the long term. And really, this spirit of the working together, getting also maybe the elephant into the room together, I think this is what we should do, and try to be as constructive as possible to try to scale up this instrument and bring it really to scale and make a difference.
Yeah. I mean, from the private sector, I would say, I mean, it's a provocative proposal, but the impact from a private sector perspective when somebody stops paying their debt is actually you get shut out completely from the market. So you know, it needs to be agreed. It needs to be part of a forgiveness type of package rather than a default. Just be my
Okay. So, okay, well, thank you for those interesting questions, and thank you to the panel for rising to them. So we've now got two sets of quick closing remarks. So I'll first of all invite Jamal Sangir, who's had a very illustrious career and wears many hats, but at the moment he's wearing the hat for the chair of the advisory group of the United Nations Economic Commission for West Asia, and will be giving some comments.
Thank you, colleague. This is a fantastic event today, and many thanks to the IMF for taking leadership. Really, I'm extremely happy. We from USQA believe that the role of IMF in leading that effort and the two papers that you have prepared are essential to give the basis of the discussion. I'm going to speak a bit about the Arab world since there was a question that came about it. Our region faces severe financial constraints. When we talk on terms of data, external debt service consume about 14% of revenue, 18.5% of their export. With the current high interest rate, inflationary pressure, and the spillover of the war in Ukraine, as well as the food and prices, the debt service and budgetary pressure of the countries in the Arab world are increasing a lot. If you look in terms of climate finance to the region, they are not much actually. We receive 8.5 more debt than grant. That's the region receive more debt than grant, more than anybody else actually. And adaptation finance remains less than 30% of total flow. Also it's priority of a region, especially for a sector like the water and the wastewater sector. So the meeting the climate finance needed so far through issuing green bond has been a good idea. We've seen it in Egypt, to take the leadership in it. It fixed to raise money, but such a strategy risks generating more debt burden in the future. We have to be much more innovative. In this context, the UNESCO has developed the climate finance, climate SDG debt swap, donor nexus initiative to address the challenge of reducing the debt service burden, improving climate finance, and accelerating implementation of the Paris Agreement. This initiative helped government to design a climate SDG in line with national priority and use key performance indicator. I want to insist on that. If you don't have key performance indicator in that swap, you will not be able to measure enough and you will not be able to implement enough. The initiative targets creditor countries for the swap who are interested in increase their budget commitment, pledges to finance climate action, and at least run until 2030. The support of creditor, however, is very important for such initiative. It should not be viewed as a financial loss to the creditor. It's very important to convince the creditor we are not coming to screw you. We are here to help get some fiscal space, help you implement, and work in partnership, as you have said here. This message has to be very clear for the creditor. In our agreement, you have what kind of financial features we are looking in the ESCO perspective. We're not asking for debt restructuring, but proposing a win-win program. Eligible country will be those middle-income countries, as debtors who are committed to honor their service, but facing fiscal stress situation that put the risk of the ability to meet expenditure commitment. And we are calling for larger volume over a medium term, and that's the question that was discussed here. Small is not beautiful for debt swap. If we don't go at scale, at speed, We're going to be another initiative that will die in 3 years down the road. As a result of that program, the key performance indicators that we have developed through national budget are important. One last item is very important. Debt swap has not to be seen in isolation from the macroeconomic stability and the debt stability, debt sustainability. That is very important to look at it from the macroeconomic perspective. In this context, Jordan has been moving very quickly to answer the question here. They have developed a program on debt swap. They have a task force that represented from the Ministry of Planning, Finance. They have developed a list of projects that we have seen. They are water, wastewater, renewable energy, and they are really moving on this kind of approach. What we need right now is to urge creditors and donors to support such program in the Arab region. And really with the leadership of ESCWA, IMF, and other player partner, I think we'll be able to do a few transactions in the next couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamal. And now for the final set of comments before we all go out and enjoy the coffee dispenser, we're very pleased to have with us the Deputy Executive Secretary for the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa to give the final closing words.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It has been a very engaging and insightful discussion. I think this is on the first day of COP. I think we're all really well aware of the huge financing gap that is ahead of us. And it's clear that the climate for nature swaps is not the only solution, and that at the same time, just to address the gap, we will have to also address the elephant in the room, which is debt. And that involves addressing both existing and future debt, as well as redefining the link between debt and nature. I think the essence of the debt for nature swap is correlating both the health of our economies and the health of our climate. And this could not be more relevant to a region than Africa, where actually countries have to spend up to 9% of their budgets in responding to climate events. So this is very key for the continent. And to illustrate maybe one more additional number to add to the numbers that have been quoted today, the adaptation requirements of African nationally determined contribution and national adaptation plans are around $438 million by 2030. Yet, the flows that we have seen over the last 2 decades, between 2000 and 2020, are only $24 million in adaptation to Africa from official climate finance sources. So you can already see the huge gap that exists on that front. This is why, actually, in the meeting of ministers of finance that we co-convened with the Egyptian government in September, between 7th and 9th of September, in preparation for COP27, the issue of sustainable debt was at the core of the discussions and the communique that came. This is also some of the among the key issues that have been highlighted in the high-level working group by the African Ministers of Finance on global financial architecture, which we held the meetings of during the annual meetings of the IMF and World Bank. So this is an issue that African ministers have really been raised, unified voice raising, the alarm on the type of challenges that they are facing and the need for action. Let me just perhaps address a few issues that are related to what has been raised earlier in the discussion about the need to, reach scale, to upscale, and the issue of utilizing the full potential of such a tool. So let me start by the issue of the scale. I think we have seen that swaps have been driven by bilateral exchanges, which are often costly in terms of administrative burdens. And African ministers have called for a sustainable debt hub, which can actually help facilitate that link to help climate vulnerable countries put forward ambitious debt for climate refinancing plans, and to allow comprehensive refinancing plans to be proposed to potential creditors. But I think another very important issue is for us to move from the millions to billions. It has to go beyond philanthropy, helping, which has been the key players, and rightfully so. I think they have really played an instrumental role. But going forward, we need to see more of the credit enhancement tools and deployed by multilateral development banks, by international large countries to support actually the climate financing needs of developing countries. So we need these type of credit enhancement tools to actually help us move to scale. And second, on the issue of simplification and ensuring value for investment, this can be achieved by having key performance indicators with climate goals, for example, in countries' ambitious nationally determined contributions. And thirdly, the issue of repositioning this option of the credit swaps. I think the discussion needs to move from resorting to it when a country is already in trouble, when they have reached debt distress and close to default, to actually proactively using that tool to support avoiding reaching to such a stage. So this will be really key going forward, to use it as a proactive tool to refinance debt, to create fiscal space for climate investment, and to also countries that may wish to move to new market based upon financing that is more affordable. Rather than existing debt and creating new liquidity. And that's why, for it to be attractive, it will need to have these credit enhancement mechanisms, because for a country to just resort to green financing, but yet they have to be faced with the same cost as regular financing, but more compliance and reporting burdens, it wouldn't make sense. There has to be incentives to encourage countries to actually have these commitments and linking to climate issues. And here, I think we have, as ECA, we've been very active on the issues of global financial architecture and working very closely with ministers of finance on it. But we've also been very active in supporting countries that are interested in climate for nature swaps, including Cape Verde, and which is actually looking into a refinancing of $200 million. And we've also been supporting countries like Senegal, who are thinking about issuing new bonds that are related to climate. But we've also been very active on other solutions, such as supporting the Congo Basin in creating a carbon registry. So all these issues, I think we need to all, as has been highlighted with many of my colleagues here, more than ever, we need to work closely together, because this is the only way to move forward. I thank you very much for this fantastic discussion, and I hope we can, turn all this into action very soon. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for those closing remarks. So please have a coffee and discuss. And this is hopefully just the start of the conversation.